There's a version of yourself that walks beside every decision, whispers in every judgment, and pulls the strings in every unexplained emotional reaction. This version knows things about life that the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. It remembers everything that's been rejected, buried, and denied. And here's the unsettling part. This hidden aspect has been running portions of life on autopilot, making choices that seem to come from nowhere, triggering reactions that feel disproportionate, and sabotaging goals in ways that defy logic. Carl Jung called this the shadow. And once the mechanism is understood, it becomes impossible to unsee how much of daily life is orchestrated by forces operating just beneath awareness. Picture a typical morning. The alarm goes off. There's an immediate flash of irritation at a partner's breathing pattern, a sudden surge of anxiety about an email that needs to be sent, or an inexplicable heaviness about the day ahead. These aren't random. They're not just moods or waking up on the wrong side of the bed. According to Jung, these are the shadow speaking, revealing itself through emotional reactions that seem to have lives of their own. Most people spend their entire lives believing they're in the driver's seat of their own minds. They make plans, set goals, and pride themselves on being reasonable, conscious individuals. But Jung discovered something that changes this entire picture. The conscious personality, the I that thinks, chooses, and acts, is actually just the tip of an enormous iceberg. Beneath the surface lies a vast unconscious realm, and within that realm dwells the shadow. The shadow isn't some mystical entity or metaphor. It's a psychological structure, a collection of all the traits, desires, emotions, and potentials that have been pushed out of conscious awareness because they didn't fit. They didn't match the image of who someone needs to be to survive in their family, succeed in their culture, or maintain their self-concept. From the moment of birth, every person begins a process of learning what's acceptable and what isn't. A child reaches for something and gets scolded. They express anger and are told, "Good children don't act that way." They show vulnerability and are told to toughen up. They display confidence and are accused of being arrogant. Piece by piece, layer by layer, certain aspects of authentic response get filed away into what Jung called the personal unconscious. This isn't a conscious decision. A 3-year-old doesn't sit down and think, "I'm going to repress my aggression to maintain familial harmony." The process happens automatically through a mechanism called repression. The psyche takes whatever can't be integrated into the developing ego, the conscious sense of self, and stores it elsewhere. But here's where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary. These repressed elements don't disappear. They don't dissolve into nothingness. They accumulate. They organize. They form their own sub-personality with its own logic, its own agenda, and its own way of expressing itself. Think about someone who prides themselves on being calm and rational. They've built an entire identity around being the reasonable one in their family or friend group. But notice what happens when they're driving and someone cuts them off. Suddenly, there's an eruption of rage that seems wildly disproportionate to the situation. That's not random. That's the shadow finding a socially permissible outlet for all the anger that's been deemed unacceptable in other contexts. Or consider the person who's extremely critical of others, constantly noticing and commenting on flaws, mistakes, and shortcomings. Jung would say this is projection, the shadow taking qualities that exist within but haven't been acknowledged and casting them onto others. It's easier to see incompetence out there than to face the internalized fear of being inadequate oneself. Projection is one of the shadow's most powerful tools. It's the psychological mechanism by which internal content gets experienced as external reality. And it's happening constantly, in ways both subtle and dramatic. Here's how it works. Whatever has been exiled from consciousness doesn't just sit quietly in the unconscious. It actively seeks expression. Since it can't express directly, that would require conscious acknowledgement, it finds indirect pathways. One of the most common pathways is projection. Someone might have been raised in an environment where ambition was seen as selfish or aggressive. To maintain love and acceptance, they suppressed their own ambitious drives. But those drives don't disappear. They become part of the shadow. As an adult, this person might find themselves intensely bothered by overly ambitious colleagues. They might moralize about work-life balance in ways that feel charged with emotion. They might unconsciously sabotage their own career advancement while rationalizing it as choosing what really matters. What they're actually encountering is their own disowned ambition being projected outward and then judged. The emotional charge, that's the clue. Jung taught that whatever generates a strong emotional reaction, particularly when the reaction seems disproportionate, is often a sign that the shadow is involved. The mechanism becomes even more complex in relationships. People don't fall in love or into intense dislike with others randomly. They're drawn to individuals who carry qualities that exist in their own shadow. The person who's repressed their own vulnerability might be magnetically attracted to someone who's openly emotional. The person who's disowned their own assertiveness might partner with someone who's dominant. At first, these projected qualities are fascinating, attractive, even intoxicating. But over time, as the projection starts to fade and reality becomes clearer, those same qualities can become sources of intense conflict. The emotional person becomes too needy. The assertive person becomes controlling. What changed? Nothing external, but the projection weakened, and suddenly there's a mirror being held up to the very things that were denied in oneself. Living with an unexamined shadow comes at a cost, though most people never calculate what they're paying. Jung understood this deeply. Whatever is denied doesn't just vanish, it extracts payment through symptoms, through limitations, through a persistent sense that life could be more, but somehow isn't. Consider the concept of psychological energy. Jung saw libido, not in Freud's narrow sexual sense, but as general psychic energy, as finite. When significant amounts of this energy are used to maintain repressions, to keep the shadow locked away, there's less available for creative pursuits, genuine relationships, and personal growth. This is why some people feel chronically tired despite adequate sleep, why others experience persistent anxiety without a clear source, or why creative blocks appear seemingly out of nowhere. The psyche is expending enormous energy, maintaining the boundary between conscious and unconscious, between persona and shadow. The persona, that's Jung's term for the social mask. The I that's presented to the world requires constant maintenance. It's exhausting to always be the helpful one when resentment is building underneath. It's draining to maintain the confident professional when imposter syndrome is screaming internally. It's depleting to perform the independent person when dependency needs are desperately seeking acknowledgement. But there's another cost, perhaps more insidious: the loss of wholeness. Jung believed that the ultimate goal of human psychological development, what he called individuation, is to become whole, to integrate all aspects of the psyche into conscious awareness. When large portions of the self remain in shadow, the person remains fractured, incomplete, living a compromised version of their potential. Think about it this way. Imagine a piano with half the keys sealed shut. It still functions, still produces music, but the full range of expression is impossible. That's life with an unintegrated shadow functional, perhaps even successful by external measures, but fundamentally limited in its range of authentic expression. Jung was brilliant at identifying how the unconscious communicates. The shadow doesn't remain silent, it sends signals constantly. Learning to read these signals is the beginning of the integration process. Dreams are the shadow's primary language. In the dream world, the censoring function of the conscious mind relaxes, and shadow content can emerge symbolically. That recurring dream about being chased? Often, it's the dreamer running from their own shadow aspects. The dream about failing a test despite having studied? Frequently, it's the shadow revealing perfectionism or fear of inadequacy, that the conscious mind won't acknowledge. But the signals appear in waking life too. Notice what triggers defensiveness. When someone makes a casual comment and it lands like a sharp blow, creating an immediate need to justify or explain, that's often shadow material being touched. The defensiveness is the psyche's alarm system, indicating that something disowned is being approached. Notice patterns in conflicts. When the same type of argument keeps happening across different relationships or contexts, it's rarely about the surface content. It's the shadow encountering itself through projection. The person who consistently feels unappreciated might be projecting their own inability to appreciate themselves. The person who's repeatedly betrayed might be avoiding acknowledgement of their own capacity for betrayal. Physical symptoms can be shadow signals too. Jung didn't separate mind and body the way modern medicine often does. He understood psychosomatic expression, the way psychological content that can't be consciously processed manifests as physical symptoms. The tension headaches that appear before situations requiring assertiveness. The stomach issues that emerge around certain people or environments. The fatigue that descends when opportunities for expression appear. Humor provides clues. The jokes someone makes, particularly the ones with an edge, often reveal shadow content. The self-deprecating humor that goes too far. Shadow material seeking expression through an acceptable channel. The sarcastic comments about others, often projection of judged internal qualities. Even consumption patterns matter. What shows, movies, or books create intense engagement? The types of characters or situations that generate strong reactions, whether fascination or disgust, often mirror shadow content. The person horrified by violent media might have disowned their own aggressive impulses. The person drawn to stories of radical freedom might have suppressed their own rebellious nature. Eventually, if psychological development is to progress, there must be a meeting, a direct encounter with the shadow. Jung described this as one of the most crucial and challenging stages of individuation. It requires courage because it means facing everything that's been avoided, everything that contradicts the carefully constructed self-image. This meeting doesn't happen in a single moment. It's a process, often triggered by life circumstances that somehow bypass normal defenses. A major loss, a relationship crisis, a professional failure, a health scare. These events can crack the persona wide enough that shadow material floods through. When this happens, it's disorienting. People often describe it as feeling like they don't recognize themselves. They might think, "I'm not the kind of person who does this," or "I don't understand where this is coming from." But that's precisely the point. It's coming from the parts of the self that haven't been consciously recognized. The meeting with the shadow often begins with seeing one's own projections. This requires brutal honesty. It means being willing to ask, what if the qualities I strongly dislike in others exist within me too? What if my judgments say more about me than about them? This can be humbling to the point of humiliation. The person who's built an identity around being honest might need to confront their own self-deception. The person who prides themselves on being kind might need to acknowledge their capacity for cruelty. The person who's always been responsible might need to face the resentment about carrying that burden. But something remarkable happens in this process. As shadow content is acknowledged rather than rejected, its power diminishes. Jung observed that what's made conscious loses its ability to control from behind the scenes. The rage that seemed to come from nowhere becomes understandable as the accumulated expression of healthy boundaries that were never set. The anxiety that felt overwhelming becomes recognizable as the protest of authentic needs that were never honored. Integration doesn't mean acting on every impulse or expressing every thought. It means acknowledgement. It means bringing into consciousness, into relationship with the ego, those aspects that have been in exile. This creates choice. When aggressive impulses are conscious, there's the option to channel them productively or to decide not to act on them. But the decision is conscious. not a reflexive repression. Here's what makes Jung's approach so different from purely reductive psychology. He didn't see the shadow as simply a repository of negative traits. He understood that some of the most valuable aspects of the person reside in shadow, what he called the gold in the shadow. Consider this. What gets repressed isn't just socially undesirable qualities. Often, positive traits get suppressed too. A child with natural artistic talent, growing up in a family that values only practical skills, might learn to bury their creativity. A naturally sensitive person in a tough-it-out environment might disown their emotional depth. A person with leadership qualities, raised to believe that standing out is dangerous, might suppress their natural authority. These gifts don't vanish, they go into shadow. They're still there, waiting for integration, but they've been unavailable to consciousness. This is why shadow work often leads not just to better self-understanding, but to the emergence of new capacities. Someone might discover, after decades, that they have artistic talent they never developed. Another person might find that beneath their agreeable persona lies genuine strength and the capacity to stand their ground. Someone else might realize they've been suppressing a sharp intellect because they learned early that being smart made others uncomfortable. Jung believed that psychological wholeness requires integrating both the dark and the golden aspects of shadow. The person becomes more complete, more capable, more authentically themselves. They gain access to the full range of human experience and expression. Shadow integration isn't a task completed and then finished. It's an ongoing relationship with the unconscious, a continuous process of becoming aware of what's been unconscious. Jung practiced this himself throughout his life, maintaining his own self-analysis and paying attention to his dreams and projections. The work involves developing what Jung called the observing ego, a part of consciousness that can witness itself without immediately identifying or judging. This observing capacity creates space between stimulus and response, between trigger and reaction. It allows for the question, where is this really coming from? Daily practices support this. Dream journaling keeps a line of communication open with the unconscious. Regular self-reflection creates opportunities to notice patterns before they become crises. Mindfulness, though Jung didn't use that term, cultivates the observing capacity. Relationships become mirrors when approached with shadow awareness. Instead of immediately blaming or defending, there's the question, what is this showing me about myself? The annoying colleague might be reflecting a disowned trait. The conflict with a friend might be revealing a projection. The repeated pattern in romantic relationships might be demonstrating an unintegrated shadow aspect seeking resolution. Active imagination, one of Jung's key techniques, involves dialoguing with shadow aspects as if they were separate personalities. This might sound strange, but it's remarkably effective. By personifying shadow elements and engaging with them consciously, integration becomes possible. The harsh inner critic can be questioned. The rebellious impulse can be given voice. The vulnerable part can be heard. The process requires compassion, something Jung emphasized, but that's often overlooked. The shadow developed for survival. Every repression, every denial, every projection served a purpose at some point. They were adaptations to circumstances that might have been genuinely dangerous or threatening. Approaching shadow work with self-compassion rather than judgment makes integration possible where harsh self-criticism would only create more repression. What does life look like when someone has done significant shadow work? Jung didn't promise that integration would make life easier or problems disappear, but he did believe it made life more authentic, more whole, more genuinely lived. There's less surprise at one's own reactions. When difficult emotions arise, there's recognition rather than bewilderment. There's still discomfort growth, and discomfort are inseparable, but not the added layer of confusion about why these feelings exist. Projections decrease. This doesn't mean never seeing qualities in others, but it means being able to distinguish between what's actually present in the other person and what's being projected. Relationships become clearer, more genuine, because they're with real people rather than with screens for projection. Energy that was locked in maintaining repressions becomes available. There's more vitality, more creativity, more capacity for genuine presence. The exhaustion of performance, of maintaining the persona at all costs, diminishes. There's also a deepening of empathy. Seeing one's own shadow honestly makes it impossible to maintain a judgmental stance toward others. If the capacity for selfishness, cruelty, cowardice, or any other judged quality can be acknowledged within, then it becomes possible to meet those qualities in others without the compulsive need to condemn or distance. Choices become more conscious. This might be the greatest practical gift of shadow integration. When motivations are clearer, when projections are recognized, when repressed impulses are acknowledged, then choices can be made from awareness rather than from the hidden agendas of the unconscious. This doesn't mean perfection. Jung was emphatic that wholeness isn't the same as perfection. A whole person still makes mistakes, still has conflicts, still experiences the full range of human limitation. But they're doing so consciously, with increasing awareness of the forces at play. The machinery of the shadow operates whether or not there's awareness of it. That's what makes Jung's work so relevant, so urgent. Every day, decisions are influenced by forces that haven't been examined. Reactions are triggered by material that hasn't been integrated. Opportunities are missed because aspects of the self remain in exile. But here's the empowering truth that Jung spent his life demonstrating: the machinery can be seen. The hidden can be made visible. The unconscious can be brought into relationship with consciousness. Not all at once, not completely. Jung believed the unconscious was too vast to ever be fully known, but progressively, meaningfully, transformatively. This work isn't comfortable. It challenges the self-image, confronts defenses, and requires acknowledging qualities and impulses that have been deemed unacceptable. But on the other side of that discomfort is something extraordinary: the possibility of living as a whole person, aware of the forces that shape experience, capable of conscious choice, and no longer controlled by machinery operating in the dark. The shadow isn't the enemy. It's the lost parts of the self, waiting for recognition, waiting for integration, waiting to contribute to the fullness of life. And the moment awareness turns toward those parts, toward that hidden machinery, the process of becoming whole begins. That's the promise and the challenge of Jung's insight. Greater consciousness, greater wholeness, greater authenticity. Not through becoming something different, but through acknowledging and integrating everything that's already there: the hidden, the denied, the cast away, the gold in the darkness. The machinery is running. The only question is whether it will continue to run unexamined, or whether awareness will illuminate its workings and, in doing so, transform what controls into what serves.